Chapter 2, Part 1 of Totem and Taboo. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Totem and Taboo by Sigmund Freud. Chapter 2, Taboo and the Ambivalence of Emotions. Part 1. Section 1. Taboo is a Polynesian word, the translation of which provides difficulties for us because we no longer possess the idea which it connotes. It was still current with the ancient Romans. Their word "sacer" was the same as the taboo of the Polynesians. The agos of the Greeks and the kodesh of the Hebrews must also have signified the same thing which the Polynesians expressed through their word taboo, and what many races in America, Africa, Madagascar, northern and central Asia express through analogous designations. For us, the meaning of taboo branches off into two opposite directions. On the one hand, it means to us sacred, consecrated, but on the other hand, it means uncanny, dangerous, forbidden, and unclean. The opposite of taboo is designated in Polynesian by the word noa. This signifies something ordinary and generally accessible. Thus, something like the concept of reserve inheres in taboo. Taboo expresses itself essentially in prohibitions and restrictions. Our combinations of holy dread would often express the meaning of taboo. The taboo restrictions are different from religious or moral prohibitions. They are not traced to a commandment of a god, but really they themselves impose their own prohibitions. They are differentiated from moral prohibitions by failing to be included in a system which declares abstinences in general to be necessary and gives reasons for this necessity. The taboo prohibitions lack all justification and are of unknown origin. Though incomprehensible to us, they are taken as a matter of course by those who are under their dominance. Wundt calls taboo the oldest unwritten code of law of humanity. It is generally assumed that taboo is older than the gods and goes back to the pre-religious age. As we are in need of an impartial presentation of the subject of taboo before subjecting it to psychoanalytic consideration, I shall now cite an excerpt from the article Taboo in the Encyclopedia Britannica, written by the anthropologist Northcote W. Thomas. Footnote: 11th edition. This article also gives the most important references. End footnote. Quote, "Properly speaking, taboo includes only (a) the sacred or unclean character of persons or things, (b) the kind of prohibition which results from this character, and (c) the sanctity or uncleanliness which results from a violation of the prohibition. The converse of taboo in Polynesia is noa, and allied forms which mean general or common. Various classes of taboo in the wider sense may be distinguished. 1. Natural or direct, the result of mana, mysterious power, inherent in a person or thing. 2. Communicated or indirect, equally the result of mana, but (a) acquired or (b) imposed by a priest, chief, or other person. 3. Intermediate, where both factors are present, as in the appropriation of a wife to her husband. The term taboo is also applied to ritual prohibitions of a different nature, but its use in these senses is better avoided. It might be argued that the term should be extended to embrace cases in which the sanction of the prohibition is the creation of a god or spirit, that is, to religious interdictions as distinguished from magical. But there is neither automatic action nor contagion in such a case, and a better term for it is religious interdiction. The objects of taboo are many. 1. Direct taboos aim at (a) protection of important persons, chiefs, priests, etc., and things against harm. (b) Safeguarding of the weak, women, children, and common people generally, from the powerful mana, magical influence, of chiefs and priests. (c) Providing against the dangers incurred by handling or coming in contact with corpses, by eating certain food, etc. (d) Guarding the chief acts of life, births, initiation, marriage, and sexual functions, against interference. (e) Securing human beings against the wrath or power of gods and spirits. Footnote: this application of the taboo can be omitted as not originally belonging in this connection. End footnote. (f) Securing unborn infants and young children, who stand in a specially sympathetic relation with their parents, from the consequences of certain actions, and more especially from the communication of qualities supposed to be derived from certain foods. 2. Taboos are imposed in order to secure against thieves the property of an individual, his fields, tools, etc." Other parts of the article may be summarized as follows. Originally, the punishment for the violation of a taboo was probably left to an inner automatic arrangement. The violated taboo avenged itself. Wherever the taboo was related to ideas of gods and demons, an automatic punishment was expected from the power of the godhead. In other cases, probably as the result of a further development of the idea, society took over the punishment of the offender, whose action has endangered his companions. Thus man's first systems of punishment are also connected with taboo. "The violation of taboo makes the offender himself taboo." The author goes on to say that certain dangers resulting from the violation of a taboo may be exorcised through acts of penance and ceremonies of purification. A peculiar power inherent in persons and ghosts, which can be transmitted from them to inanimate objects, is regarded as the source of the taboo. This part of the article reads as follows, "Persons or things which are regarded as taboo may be compared to objects charged with electricity. They are the seat of tremendous power which is transmittable by contact and may be liberated with destructive effect if the organisms which provoke its discharge are too weak to resist it. The result of a violation of taboo depends partly on the strength of the magical influence inherent in the taboo object or person, partly on the strength of the opposing mana of the violator of the taboo. Thus, kings and chiefs are possessed of great power, and it is death for their subjects to address them directly. But a minister or other person of greater mana than common can approach them unharmed, and can in turn be approached by their inferiors without risk. So, too, indirect taboos depend for their strength on the mana of him who opposes them. If it is a chief or priest, they are more powerful than those imposed by a common person." The fact that a taboo is transmissible has surely given rise to the effort of removing it through expiatory ceremonies. The author states that there are permanent and temporary taboos. The former comprise priests and chiefs as well as the dead and everything that has belonged to them. Temporary taboos attach themselves to certain conditions, such as menstruation and childbed, the status of the warrior before and after the expedition, the activities of fishing and of the chase, and similar activities. A general taboo may also be imposed upon a large district, like an ecclesiastical interdict, and may then last for years. If I judge my readers' impressions correctly, I dare say that after hearing all that was said about taboo, they are far from knowing what to understand by it and where to store it in their minds. This is surely due to the insufficient information I have given and to the omission of all discussions concerning the relation of taboo to superstition, to belief in the soul, and to religion. On the other hand, I fear that a more detailed description of what is known about taboo would be still more confusing. I can therefore assure the reader that the state of affairs is really far from clear. We may say, however, that we deal with a series of restrictions which these primitive races impose upon themselves. This and that is forbidden without any apparent reason, nor does it occur to them to question this matter, for they subject themselves to these restrictions as a matter of course, and are convinced that any transgression will be punished automatically in the most severe manner. There are reliable reports that innocent transgressions of such prohibitions have actually been punished automatically. For instance, the innocent offender who had eaten from a forbidden animal became deeply depressed, expected his death, and then actually died. The prohibitions mostly concern matters which are capable of enjoyment, such as freedom of movement and unrestrained intercourse. In some cases they appear very ingenious, evidently representing abstinences and renunciations. In other cases their content is quite incomprehensible. They seem to concern themselves with trifles and give the impression of ceremonials. Something like a theory seems to underlie all these prohibitions. It seems as if these prohibitions are necessary because some persons and objects possess a dangerous power which is transmitted by contact with the object so charged, almost like a contagion. The quantity of this dangerous property is also taken into consideration. Some persons or things have more of it than others, and the danger is precisely in accordance with the charge. The most peculiar part of it is that any one who has violated such a prohibition assumes the nature of the forbidden object as if he had absorbed the whole dangerous charge. This power is inherent in all persons who are more or less prominent, such as kings, priests, and the newly born. In all exceptional physical states, such as menstruation, puberty, and birth, in everything sinister like illness and death, and in everything connected with these conditions by virtue of contagion or dissemination. However, the term taboo includes all persons, localities, objects, and temporary conditions which are carriers or sources of this mysterious attribute. The prohibition derived from this attribute is also designated as taboo. And lastly, taboo, in the literal sense, includes everything that is sacred, above the ordinary, and at the same time dangerous, unclean, and mysterious. Both this word and the system corresponding to it express a fragment of psychic life which really is not comprehensible to us. And indeed it would seem that no understanding of it could be possible without entering into the study of the belief in spirits and demons which is so characteristic of these low grades of culture. Now why should we take interest at all in the riddle of taboo? Not only, I think, because every psychological problem is well worth the effort of investigation for its own sake, but for other reasons as well. It may be surmised that the taboo of Polynesian savages is after all not so remote from us as we were at first inclined to believe. The moral and customary prohibitions which we ourselves obey may have some essential relation to this primitive taboo, the explanation of which may in the end throw light upon the dark origin of our own categorical imperative. We are therefore inclined to listen with keen expectations when an investigator like W. Wundt gives his interpretation of taboo, especially as he promises to, quote, go back to the very roots of the taboo concepts, end quote. Wundt states that the idea of taboo includes all customs which express dread of particular objects connected with cultic ideas or of actions having reference to them. On another occasion he says, quote, in accordance with the general sense of the word we understand by taboo every prohibition laid down in customs or manners or in expressly formulated laws, not to touch an object or to take it for one's own use, or to make use of certain prescribed words, end quote. Accordingly, there would not be a single race or stage of culture which had escaped the injurious effects of taboo. Wundt then shows why he finds it more practical to study the nature of taboo in the primitive states of Australian savages rather than in the higher culture of the Polynesian races. In the case of the Australians, he divides taboo prohibitions into three classes according as they concern animals, persons, or other objects. The animal taboo, which consists essentially of the taboo against killing and eating, forms the nucleus of totemism. The taboo of the second class, which has human beings for its object, is of an essentially different nature. To begin with, it is restricted to conditions which bring about an unusual situation in life for the person tabooed. Thus young men at the feast of initiation, women during menstruation and immediately after delivery, newly born children, the diseased, and especially the dead, are all taboo. The constantly used property of any person, such as his clothes, tools, and weapons, is permanently taboo for everybody else. In Australia, the new name which a youth receives at his initiation into manhood becomes part of his own personal property. It is taboo and must be kept secret. The taboos of the third class, which apply to trees, plants, houses, and localities, are more variable and seem only to follow the rule that anything which for any reason arouses dread or is mysterious becomes subject to taboo. Wundt himself has to acknowledge that the changes which taboo undergoes in the richer culture of the Polynesians and in the Malayan archipelago are not very profound. The greater social differentiation of these races manifests itself in the fact that chiefs, kings, and priests exercise an especially effective taboo and are themselves exposed to the strongest taboo compulsion. The real sources of taboo lie deeper than in the interests of the privileged classes. Quote, They begin where the most primitive and at the same time the most enduring human impulses have their origin, namely in the fear of the effect of demonic powers." The taboo, which originally was nothing more than the objectified fear of the demonic power thought to be concealed in the tabooed object, forbids the irritation of this power and demands the placation of the demon whenever the taboo has been knowingly or unknowingly violated." The taboo then gradually became an autonomous power which has detached itself from demonism. It becomes the compulsion of custom and tradition and finally of the law. "But the commandment concealed behind taboo prohibitions, which differ materially according to place and time, have originally the meaning, 'Beware of the wrath of the demons.'" Wundt therefore teaches that taboo is the expression and evolution of the belief of primitive races in demonic powers, and that later taboo has disassociated itself from this origin and has remained a power simply because it was one by virtue of a kind of a psychic persistence, and in this manner it became the root of our customs and laws. As little as one can object to the first part of this statement, I feel, however, that I am only voicing the impression of many of my readers if I call Wundt's explanation disappointing. Wundt's explanation is far from going back to the sources of taboo concepts or to their deepest roots. For neither fear nor demons can be accepted in psychology as finalities defying any further deduction. It would be different if demons really existed, but we know that, like gods, they are only the product of the psychic powers of man. They have been created from and out of something. Wundt also expresses a number of important, though not altogether clear opinions about the double meaning of taboo. According to him, the division between sacred and unclean does not yet exist in the first primitive stages of taboo. For this reason, these conceptions entirely lack the significance which they could only acquire later on when they came to be contrasted. The animal, person, or place on which there is a taboo is demonic, that is, not sacred and therefore not yet, in the later sense, unclean. The expression taboo is particularly suitable for this undifferentiated and intermediate meaning of the demonic, in the sense of something which may not be touched, since it emphasizes a characteristic which finally adheres both to what is sacred and to the unclean, namely, the dread of contact. But the fact that this important characteristic is permanently held in common points to the existence of an original agreement here between these two spheres, which gave way to a differentiation only as the result of further conditions through which both finally developed into opposites. The belief associated with the original taboo, according to which a demonic power concealed in the object avenges the touching of it or its forbidden use by bewitching the offender, was still an entirely objectified fear. This had not yet separated into the two forms which it assumed at a more developed stage, namely, awe and aversion. How did this separation come about? According to Wundt, this was done through the transference of taboo prohibition from the sphere of demons to that of theistic conceptions. The antithesis of sacred and unclean coincides with the succession of two mythological stages, the first of which did not entirely disappear when the second was reached, but continued in a state of greatly lowered esteem, which gradually turned into contempt. It is a general law in mythology that a preceding stage, just because it has been overcome and pushed back by a higher stage, maintains itself next to it in a debased form, so that the objects of its veneration become objects of its aversion. Wundt's further elucidations refer to the relation of taboo to lustration and sacrifice. Section 2. He who approaches the problem of taboo from the field of psychoanalysis, which is concerned with the study of the unconscious part of the individual's psychic life, needs but a moment's reflection to realize that these phenomena are by no means foreign to him. He knows people who have individually created such taboo prohibitions for themselves, which they follow as strictly as savages observe the taboos common to their tribe or society. If he were not accustomed to call these individuals compulsive neurotics, he would find the term taboo disease quite appropriate for their malady. Psychoanalytic investigation has taught him the clinical etiology and the essential part of the psychological mechanism of this compulsion disease, so that he cannot resist applying what he has learnt there to explain corresponding manifestations in folk psychology. There is one warning to which we shall have to give heed in making this attempt. The similarity between taboo and compulsion disease may be purely superficial, holding good only for the manifestations of both, without extending into their deeper characteristics. Nature loves to use identical forms in the most widely different biological connections, as for instance for coral stems in plants, and even for certain crystals, or for the formation of certain chemical precipitates. It would certainly be both premature and unprofitable to base conclusions relating to interrelationships upon the correspondence of merely mechanical conditions. We shall bear this warning in mind, without, however, giving up our intended comparison on account of the possibility of such confusions. The first and most striking correspondence between the compulsion prohibitions of neurotics and taboo lies in the fact that the original of these prohibitions is just as unmotivated and enigmatic. They have appeared at some time or other and must now be retained on account of an unconquerable anxiety. An external threat of punishment is superfluous because an inner certainty, a conscience, exists that violation will be followed by unbearable disaster. The very most that compulsion patients can tell us is the vague premonition that some person of their environment will suffer harm if they should violate the prohibition. Of what the harm is to consist is not known, and this inadequate information is more likely to be obtained during the later discussions of the expiatory and defensive actions than when the prohibitions themselves are being discussed. As in the case of taboo, the nucleus of the neurotic prohibition is the act of touching, whence we derive the name touching phobia or délire de toucher. The prohibition extends not only to direct contact with the body, but also to the figurative use of the phrase as to come into contact or be in touch with someone or something. Anything that leads the thoughts to what is prohibited and thus calls forth mental contact is just as much prohibited as immediate bodily contact. This same extension is also found in taboo. Some prohibitions are easily understood from their purpose, but others strike us as incomprehensible, foolish, and senseless. We designate such commands as ceremonials, and we find that taboo customs show the same variations. Obsessive prohibitions possess an extraordinary capacity for displacement. They make use of almost any form of connection to extend from one object to another, and then in turn make this new object impossible, as one of my patients aptly puts it. This impossibility finally lays an embargo upon the whole world. The compulsion neurotics act as if the impossible persons and things were the carriers of a dangerous contagion which is ready to displace itself through contact to all neighboring things. We have already emphasized the same characteristics of contagion and transference in the description of taboo prohibitions. We also know that anyone who has violated a taboo by touching something which is taboo becomes taboo himself, and no one may come into contact with him. I shall put side by side two examples of transference, or to use a better term, displacement, one from the life of the Maori and the other from my observation of a woman suffering from a compulsion neurosis. Quote, "For a similar reason, a Maori chief would not blow on a fire with his mouth, for his sacred breath would communicate its sanctity to the fire, which would pass it on to the meat in the pot, which would pass it on to the man who ate the meat, which was in the pot, which stood on the fire, which was breathed on by the chief, so that the eater, infected by the chief's breath conveyed through these intermediaries, would surely die." End quote. From Frazer, The Golden Bough. My patient demanded that a utensil which her husband had purchased and brought home should be removed lest it make the place where she lives impossible. For she has heard that this object was bought in a store which is situated, let us say, in Stagg Street. But as the word Stagg is the name of a friend, now in a distant city, whom she has known in her youth under her maiden name, and whom she now finds impossible, that is taboo. The object bought in Vienna is just as taboo as this friend with whom she does not want to come in contact. Compulsion prohibitions, like taboo prohibitions, entail the most extraordinary renunciations and restrictions of life, but a part of these can be removed by carrying out certain acts which now also must be done because they have acquired a compulsive character, obsessive acts. There is no doubt that these acts are in the nature of penances, expiations, defense reactions, and purifications. The most common of these obsessive acts is washing with water (washing obsession). A part of the taboo prohibitions can also be replaced in this way, that is to say, their violation can be made good through such a ceremonial, and here too lustration through water is the preferred way. Let us now summarize the points in which the correspondence between taboo customs and symptoms of compulsion neurosis are most clearly manifested. 1. In the lack of motivation of the commandments. 2. In their enforcement through an inner need. 3. In their capacity of displacement and in the danger of contagion from what is prohibited. 4. And in the causation of ceremonial actions and commandments which emanate from the forbidden. However, psychoanalysis has made us familiar with the clinical history as well as the psychic mechanism of compulsion neurosis. Thus the history of a typical case of touching phobia reads as follows. In the very beginning, during the early period of childhood, the person manifested a strong pleasure in touching himself, the object of which was much more specialized than one would be inclined to expect. Presently the carrying out of this very pleasurable act of touching was opposed by a prohibition from without. Both the pleasure and the prohibition referred to touching one's own genitals. The prohibition was accepted because it was supported by strong inner forces. The relation to beloved persons who imposed the prohibition. It proved to be stronger than the impulse which wanted to manifest itself through this act of touching. But due to the primitive psychic constitution of the child, this prohibition did not succeed in abolishing the impulse. Its only success lay in repressing the impulse, pleasure of touching, and banishing it into the unconscious. Both the prohibition and the impulse remained. The impulse because it had only been repressed and not abolished, the prohibition because if it had ceased, the impulse would have broken through into consciousness and would have been carried out. An unsolved situation, psychic fixation, had thus been created, and now everything else emanated from the continued conflict between prohibition and impulse. The main characteristic of the psychic constellation which has thus undergone fixation lies in what one might call the ambivalent behavior. To use an excellent term coined by Bleuler. Ambivalent behavior of the individual to the object, or rather to an action regarding it. The individual constantly wants to carry out this action, the act of touching. He sees in it the highest pleasure, but he may not carry it out, and he even abominates it. The opposition between these two streams cannot be easily adjusted because there is no other way to express it. They are so localized in the psychic life that they cannot meet. The prohibition becomes fully conscious, while the surviving pleasure of touching remains unconscious, the person knowing nothing about it. If this psychological factor did not exist, the ambivalence could neither maintain itself so long nor lead to such subsequent manifestations. In the clinical history of the case we have emphasized the appearance of the prohibition in early childhood as the determining factor, but for the further elaboration of the neurosis this role is played by the repression which appears at this age. On account of the repression which has taken place, which is connected with forgetting (amnesia), the motivation of the prohibition that has become conscious remains unknown, and all attempts to unravel it intellectually must fail, as the point of attack cannot be found. The prohibition owes its strength, its compulsive character, to its association with its unknown counterpart, the hidden and unabated pleasure, that is to say, to an inner need in which conscious insight is lacking. The transferability and reproductive power of the prohibition reflect a process which harmonizes with the unconscious pleasure and is very much facilitated through the psychological determinants of the unconscious. The pleasure of the impulse constantly undergoes displacement in order to escape the blocking which it encounters, and seeks to acquire surrogates for the forbidden in the form of substitutive objects and actions. For the same reason the prohibition also wanders and spreads to the new aims of the proscribed impulse. Every new advance of the repressed libido is answered by the prohibition with a new severity. The mutual inhibition of these two contending forces creates a need for discharge and for lessening the existing tension, in which we may recognize the motivation for the compulsive acts. In the neurosis there are distinctly acts of compromise, which on the one hand may be regarded as proofs of remorse and efforts to expiate and similar actions, but on the other hand they are at the same time substitutive actions, which recompense the impulse for what has been forbidden. It is a law of neurotic diseases that these obsessive acts serve the impulse more and more and come nearer and nearer to the original forbidden act. We may now make the attempt to study taboo as if it were of the same nature as the compulsive prohibitions of our patients. It must naturally be clearly understood that many of the taboo prohibitions which we shall study are already secondary, displaced and distorted, so that we shall have to be satisfied if we can shed some light upon the earliest and most important taboo prohibitions. We must also remember that the differences in the situation of the savage and of the neurotic may be important enough to exclude complete correspondence and prevent a point-by-point transfer from one to the other, such as would be possible if we were dealing with exact copies. First of all, it must be said that it is useless to question savages as to the real motivation of their prohibitions or as to the genesis of taboo. According to our assumption, they must be incapable of telling us anything about it, since this motivation is unconscious to them. But following the model of the compulsive prohibition, we shall construct the history of a taboo as follows. Taboos are very ancient prohibitions which at one time were forced upon a generation of primitive people from without. That is, they probably were forcibly impressed upon them by an earlier generation. These prohibitions concern actions for which there existed a strong desire. The prohibitions maintained themselves from generation to generation, perhaps only as the result of a tradition set up by paternal and social authority. But in later generations they have perhaps already become organized as a piece of inherited psychic property. Whether they are such innate ideas or whether these have brought about the fixation of the taboo by themselves or by cooperating with education, no one could decide in the particular case in question. The persistence of taboo teaches, however, one thing, namely, that the original pleasure to do the forbidden still continues among the taboo races. They therefore assume an ambivalent attitude toward their taboo prohibitions. In their unconscious they would like nothing better than to transgress them, but they are also afraid to do it. They are afraid just because they would like to transgress, and the fear is stronger than the pleasure. But in every individual of the race the desire for it is unconscious, just as in the neurotic. The oldest and most important taboo prohibitions are the two basic laws of totemism, namely not to kill the totem animal and to avoid sexual intercourse with totem companions of the other sex. It would therefore seem that these must have been the oldest and strongest desires of mankind. We cannot understand this and therefore we cannot use these examples to test our assumptions as long as the meaning and the origin of the totemic system is so wholly unknown to us. But the very wording of these taboos and the fact that they occur together will remind anyone who knows the results of the psychoanalytic investigation of individuals of something quite definite which psychoanalysts call the central point of the infantile wish life and the nucleus of the later neurosis. All other varieties of taboo phenomena which have led to the attempted classifications noted above become unified if we sum them up in the following sentence. The basis of taboo is a forbidden action for which there exists a strong inclination in the unconscious. We know, without understanding it, that whoever does what is prohibited and violates the taboo becomes himself taboo. But how can we connect this fact with the other? Namely, that the taboo adheres not only to persons who have done what is prohibited, but also to persons who are in exceptional circumstances, to these circumstances themselves, and to impersonal things. What can this dangerous attribute be, which always remains the same under all these different conditions? Only one thing, namely, the propensity to arouse the ambivalence of man and to tempt him to violate the prohibition. An individual who has violated a taboo becomes himself taboo because he has the dangerous property of tempting others to follow his example. He arouses envy. Why should he be allowed to do what is prohibited to others? He is therefore really contagious, in so far as every example incites to imitation, and therefore he himself must be avoided. But a person may become permanently or temporarily taboo without having violated any taboos, for the simple reason that he is in a condition which has the property of inciting the forbidden desires of others and of awakening the ambivalent conflict in them. Most of the exceptional positions and conditions have this character and possess this dangerous power. The king or chieftain rouses envy of his prerogatives. Everybody would perhaps like to be king. The dead, the newly born, and women when they are incapacitated, all act as incitements on account of their peculiar helplessness, while the individual who has just reached sexual maturity tempts through the promise of a new pleasure. Therefore all these persons and all their conditions are taboo, for one must not yield to the temptations which they offer. Now, too, we understand why the forces inherent in the mana of various persons can neutralize one another so that the mana of one individual can partly cancel that of the other. The taboo of a king is too strong for his subject because the social difference between them is too great. But a minister, for example, can become the harmless mediator between them. Translated from the language of taboo into the language of normal psychology, this means the subject who shrinks from the tremendous temptation which contact with the king creates for him can brook the intercourse of an official whom he does not have to envy so much and whose position perhaps seems attainable to him. The minister, on his part, can moderate his envy of the king by taking into consideration the power that has been granted to him. Thus, smaller differences in the magic power that lead to temptation are less to be feared than exceptionally big differences. It is equally clear how the violation of certain taboo prohibitions becomes a social danger which must be punished or expiated by all the members of society lest it harm them all. This danger really exists if we substitute the known impulses for the unconscious desires. It consists in the possibility of imitation, as a result of which society would soon be dissolved. If the others did not punish the violation, they would perforce become aware that they want to imitate the evildoer. Though the secret meaning of a taboo prohibition cannot possibly be of so special a nature as in the case of a neurosis, we must not be astonished to find that touching plays a similar role in taboo prohibition as in the délire de toucher. To touch is the beginning of every act of possession, of every attempt to make use of a person or thing. We have interpreted the power of contagion which inheres in the taboo as the property of leading into temptation and of inciting to imitation. This does not seem to be in accord with the fact that the contagiousness of the taboo is above all manifested in the transference to objects which thus themselves become carriers of the taboo. This transferability of the taboo reflects what is found in the neurosis, namely the constant tendency of the unconscious impulse to become displaced through associative channels upon new objects. Our attention is thus drawn to the fact that the dangerous magic power of the mana corresponds to two real faculties, the capacity of reminding man of his forbidden wishes, and the apparently more important one of tempting him to violate the prohibition in the service of these wishes. Both functions reunite into one, however, if we assume it to be in accord with a primitive psychic life that with the awakening of a memory of a forbidden action there should also be combined the awakening of the tendency to carry out the action. Memory and temptation then again coincide. We must also admit that if the example of a person who has violated a prohibition leads another to the same action, the disobedience of the prohibition has been transmitted like a contagion, just as the taboo is transferred from a person to an object and from this to another. If the violation of a taboo can be condoned through expiation or penance, which means, of course, a renunciation of a possession or a liberty, we have the proof that the observance of a taboo regulation was itself a renunciation of something really wished for. The omission of one renunciation is cancelled through a renunciation at some other point. This would lead us to conclude that as far as taboo ceremonials are concerned, penance is more primitive than purification. Let us now summarize what understanding we have gained of taboo through its comparison with the compulsive prohibition of the neurotic. Taboo is very primitive prohibition imposed from without, by an authority, and directed against the strongest desires of man. The desire to violate it continues in the unconscious. Persons who obey the taboo have an ambivalent feeling toward what is affected by the taboo. The magic power attributed to the taboo goes back to its ability to lead man into temptation. It behaves like a contagion because the example is contagious, and because the prohibited desire becomes displacing in the unconscious upon something else. The expiation for the violation of a taboo through a renunciation proves that a renunciation is at the basis of the observance of the taboo. Section 3. We may ask what we have gained from the comparison of taboo with compulsion neurosis, and what value can be claimed for the interpretation we have given on the basis of this comparison. Our interpretation is evidently of no value unless it offers an advantage not to be had in any other way, and unless it affords a better understanding of taboo than was otherwise possible. We might claim that we have already given proof of its usefulness in what has been said above. But we shall have to try to strengthen our proof by continuing the explanation of taboo prohibitions and customs in detail. But we can avail ourselves of another method. We can shape our investigation so as to ascertain whether a part of the assumptions which we have transferred from the neurosis to the taboo, or the conclusions at which we have thereby arrived, can be demonstrated directly in the phenomena of taboo. We must decide, however, what we want to look for. The assertion concerning the genesis of taboo, namely, that it was derived from a primitive prohibition which was once imposed from without, cannot, of course, be proved. We shall therefore seek to confirm those psychological conditions for taboo with which we have become acquainted in the case of compulsion neurosis. How did we gain our knowledge of these psychological factors in the case of neurosis? Through the analytical study of the symptoms, especially the compulsive actions, the defense reactions, and the obsessive commands. These mechanisms gave every indication of having been derived from ambivalent impulses or tendencies. They either represented simultaneously the wish and counter-wish, or they served preponderantly one of the two contrary tendencies. If we should now succeed in showing that ambivalence, that is, the sway of contrary tendencies, exists also in the case of taboo regulations, or if we should find among the taboo mechanisms some which, like neurotic obsessions, give simultaneous expression to both currents, we would have established what is practically the most important point in the psychological correspondence between taboo and compulsion neurosis. We have already mentioned that the two fundamental taboo prohibitions are inaccessible to our analysis because they belong to totemism. Another part of the taboo rules is of secondary origin and cannot be used for our purpose. For among these races taboo has become the general form of law-giving and has helped to promote social tendencies which are certainly younger than taboo itself, as for instance the taboos imposed by chiefs and priests to ensure their property and privileges. But there still remains a large group of laws which we may undertake to investigate. Among these I lay stress on those taboos which are attached (a) to enemies, (b) to chiefs, and (c) to the dead. The material for our investigation is taken from the excellent collection of J. G. Frazer in his great work, The Golden Bough. End of Chapter 2, Part 1. Read by Mary Schneider. Totem and Taboo, Resemblances between the Psychic Lives of Savages and Neurotics, by Professor Dr. Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Totem and Taboo, Chapter 2, Taboo and the Ambivalence of Emotion, Part 2. A. The treatment of enemies. Inclined as we may have been to ascribe to savage and semi-savage races uninhibited and remorseless cruelty towards their enemies, it is of great interest to us to learn that with them too the killing of a person compels the observation of a series of rules which are associated with taboo customs. These rules are easily brought under 4 groups. They demand 1. Reconciliation with the slain enemy, 2. Restrictions, 3. Acts of expiation and purifications of the manslayer, and 4. Certain ceremonial rites. The incomplete reports do not allow us to decide with certainty how general or how isolated such taboo customs may be among these races. But this is a matter of indifference as far as our interest in these occurrences is concerned. Still, it may be assumed that we are dealing with widespread customs and not with isolated peculiarities. The reconciliation customs practiced on the island of Timor after a victorious band of warriors has returned with the severed heads of the vanquished enemy are especially significant because the leader of the expedition is subject to heavy additional restrictions. Quote from Fraser. At the solemn entry of the victors, sacrifices are made to conciliate the souls of the enemy. Otherwise, one would have to expect harm to come to the victors. A dance is given and a song is sung in which the slain enemy is mourned and his forgiveness is implored. Be not angry, they say, because your head is here with us. Had we been less lucky, our heads might have been exposed in your village. We have offered the sacrifice to appease you. Your spirit may now rest and leave us at peace. Why were you our enemy? Would it not have been better that we should remain friends? Then your blood would not have been spilt, and your head would not have been cut off. End quote. Similar customs are found among the Palu in Celebes. The Gallas sacrifice to the spirits of their dead enemies before they return to their home villages. Other races have found methods of making friends, guardians, and protectors out of their former enemies after they are dead. This consists in the tender treatment of the severed heads, of which many wild tribes of Borneo boast. When the Sea Dayaks of Sarawak bring home a head from a war expedition, they treat it for months with the greatest kindness and courtesy and address it with the most endearing names in their language. The best morsels from their meals are put into its mouth, together with tidbits and cigars. The dead enemy is repeatedly entreated to hate his former friends and to bestow his love upon his new hosts because he has now become one of them. It would be a great mistake to think that any derision is attached to this treatment, horrible though it may seem to us. Observers have been struck by the mourning for the enemy after he is slain and scalped among several of the wild tribes of North America. When a Choctaw had killed an enemy, he began a month's mourning during which he submitted himself to serious restrictions. The Dakota Indians mourned in the same way. One authority mentions that the Osage Indians, after mourning for their own dead, mourned for their foes as if they had been friends. Before proceeding to the other classes of taboo customs for the treatment of enemies, we must define our position in regard to a pertinent objection. Both Fraser as well as other authorities may well be quoted against us to show that the motive for these rules of reconciliation is quite simple and has nothing to do with ambivalence. These races are dominated by a superstitious fear of the spirits of the slain, a fear which was also familiar to classical antiquity, and which the great British dramatist brought upon the stage in the hallucinations of Macbeth and Richard III. From this superstition, all the reconciliation rules, as well as the restrictions and expiations which we shall discuss later, can be logically deduced. Moreover, the ceremonies included in the 4th group also argue for this interpretation, since the only explanation of which they admit is the effort to drive away the spirits of the slain which pursue the manslayers. Besides, the savages themselves directly admit their fear of the spirits of their slain foes and trace back the taboo customs under discussion to this fear. This objection is certainly pertinent, and if it were adequate as well, we would gladly spare ourselves the trouble of our attempt to find a further explanation. We postpone the consideration of this objection until later, and for the present merely contrast it to the interpretation derived from our previous discussion of taboo. All these rules of taboo lead us to conclude that other impulses besides those that are merely hostile find expression in the behavior towards enemies. We see in them manifestations of repentance, a regard for the enemy, and of a bad conscience for having slain him. It seems that the commandment, "Thou shalt not slay," which could not be violated without punishment, existed also among these savages, long before any legislation was received from the hands of a god. We now return to the remaining classes of taboo rules. The restrictions laid upon the victorious manslayer are unusually frequent and are mostly of a serious nature. In Timor, compare the reconciliation customs mentioned above, the leader of the expedition cannot return to his house under any circumstances. A special hut is erected for him in which he spends 2 months engaged in the observance of various rules of purification. During this period he may not see his wife or nourish himself. Another person must put his food into his mouth. Among some Dayak tribes, warriors returning from a successful expedition must remain sequestered for several days and abstain from certain foods. They may not touch iron and must remain away from their wives. In Logia, an island near New Guinea, men who have killed an enemy or have taken part in the killing lock themselves up in their houses for a week. They avoid every intercourse with their wives and friends. They do not touch their victuals with their hands and live on nothing but vegetable foods which are cooked for them in special dishes. As a reason for this last restriction, it is alleged that they must smell the blood of the slain. Otherwise they would sicken and die. Among the Toaripi or Motu tribes of New Guinea, a manslayer must not approach his wife and must not touch his food with his fingers. A second person must feed him with special food. This continues until the next new moon. I avoid the complete enumeration of all the cases of restrictions of the victorious slayer mentioned by Frazer, and emphasize only such cases in which the character of taboo is especially noticeable, or where the restriction appears in connection with expiation, purification, and ceremonial. Among the Monumbos in German New Guinea, a man who has killed an enemy in combat becomes unclean, the same word being employed which is applied to women during menstruation or confinement. For a considerable period he is not allowed to leave the men's clubhouse, while the inhabitants of his village gather about him and celebrate his victory with songs and dances. He must not touch anyone, not even his wife and children. If he did so, they would be afflicted with boils. He finally becomes clean through washing and other ceremonies. Among the Natchez in North America, young warriors who had procured their first scalp were bound for 6 months to the observance of certain renunciations. They were not allowed to sleep with their wives or to eat meat, and received only fish and maize pudding as nourishment. When a Choctaw had killed and scalped an enemy, he began a period of mourning for 1 month, during which he was not allowed to comb his hair. When his head itched, he was not allowed to scratch it with his hand, but used a small stick for this purpose. After a Pima Indian had killed an Apache, he had to submit himself to severe ceremonies of purification and expiation. During a fasting period of 16 days, he was not allowed to touch meat or salt, to look at a fire, or to speak to anyone. He lived alone in the woods, where he was waited upon by an old woman who brought him a small allowance of food. He often bathed in the nearest river, and carried a lump of clay on his head as a sign of mourning. On the 17th day there took place a public ceremony through which he and his weapons were solemnly purified. As the Pima Indians took the manslayer taboo much more seriously than their enemies, and unlike them did not postpone expiation and purification until the end of the expedition, their prowess in war suffered very much through their moral severity, or what might be called their piety. In spite of their extraordinary bravery, they proved to be unsatisfactory allies to the Americans in their wars against the Apaches. The detail and variations of these expiatory and purifying ceremonies after the killing of an enemy would be most interesting for purposes of a more searching study, but I need not enumerate any more of them here, because they cannot furnish us with any new points of view. I might mention that the temporary or permanent isolation of the professional executioner, which was maintained up to our time, is a case in point. The position of the freeholder in medieval society really conveys a good idea of the taboo of savages. The current explanation of all these rules of reconciliation, restriction, expiation, and purification combines two principles, namely, the extension of the taboo of the dead to everything that has come into contact with him, and the fear of the spirit of the slain. In what combination these two elements are to explain the ceremonial, whether they are to be considered as of equal value, or whether one of them is primary and the other secondary, and which one, is nowhere stated. Nor would this be an easy matter to decide. In contradistinction to all this, we emphasize the unity which our interpretation gains by deducing all these rules from the ambivalence of the emotion of savages toward their enemies. B. The taboo of rulers. The behavior of primitive races toward their chiefs, kings, and priests is controlled by two principles which seem rather to supplement than to contradict each other. They must both be guarded and be guarded against. Both objects are accomplished through innumerable rules of taboo. Why one must guard against rulers is already known to us, because they are the bearers of that mysterious and dangerous magic power which communicates itself by contact, like an electrical charge, bringing death and destruction to anyone not protected by a similar charge. All direct or indirect contact with this dangerous sacredness is therefore avoided. And where it cannot be avoided, a ceremonial has been found to ward off the dreaded consequences. The Nubas in East Africa, for instance, believe that they must die if they enter the house of their priest king, but that they escape this danger if on entering they bare the left shoulder and induce the king to touch it with his hand. Thus we have the remarkable case of the king's touch becoming the healing and protective measure against the very dangers that arise from contact with the king. But it is probably a question of the healing power, of the intentional touching on the king's part, in contradistinction to the danger of touching him. In other words, of the opposition between passivity and activity towards the king. Where the healing power of the royal touch is concerned, we do not have to look for examples among savages. In comparatively recent times, the kings of England exercised this power upon scrofula, whence it was called the king's evil. Neither Queen Elizabeth nor any of her successors renounced this part of the royal prerogative. Charles I is said to have healed 100 sufferers at one time in the year 1633. Under his dissolute son, Charles II, after the great English Revolution had passed, royal healings of scrofula attained their greatest vogue. This king is said to have touched close to 100,000 victims of scrofula in the course of his reign. The crush of those seeking to be cured used to be so great that on one occasion 6 or 7 patients suffered death by suffocation instead of being healed. The skeptical king of Orange, William III, who became king of England after the banishment of the Stuarts, refused to exercise the spell. On the one occasion when he consented to practice the touch, he did so with the words, "May God give you better health and more sense." The following account will bear witness to the terrible effect of touching, by virtue of which a person, even though unintentionally, becomes active against his king or against what belongs to him. A chief of high rank and great holiness in New Zealand happened to leave the remains of his meal by the roadside. A young slave came along, a strong, healthy fellow, who saw what was left over and started to eat it. Hardly had he finished when a horrified spectator informed him of his offense in eating the meal of the chief. The man had been a strong, brave warrior, but as soon as he heard this he collapsed and was afflicted by terrible convulsions, from which he died toward sunset of the following day. A Maori woman ate a certain fruit and then learned that it came from a place on which there was a taboo. She cried out that the spirit of the chief whom she had thus offended would surely kill her. This incident occurred in the afternoon, and on the next day at 12 o'clock she was dead. The tinder box of a Maori chief once cost several persons their lives. The chief had lost it, and those who found it used it to light their pipes. When they learned whose property the tinder box was, they all died of fright. It is hardly astonishing that the need was felt to isolate dangerous persons, like chiefs and priests, by building a wall around them which made them inaccessible to others. We surmise that this wall, which originally was constructed out of taboo rules, still exists today in the form of court ceremony. But probably the greater part of this taboo of the rulers cannot be traced back to the need of guarding against them. The other point of view in the treatment of privileged persons, the need of guarding them from dangers with which they are threatened, has had a distinct share in the creation of taboo and therefore of the origin of court etiquette. The necessity of guarding the king from every conceivable danger arises from his great importance for the weal and woe of his subjects. Strictly speaking, he is a person who regulates the course of the world. His people have to thank him not only for rain and sunshine, which allow the fruits of the earth to grow, but also for the wind, which brings the ships to their shores, and for the solid ground on which they set their feet. These savage kings are endowed with a wealth of power and an ability to bestow happiness which only gods possess. Certainly in later stages of civilization, none but the most servile courtiers would play the hypocrite to the extent of crediting their sovereigns with the possession of attributes similar to these. It seems like an obvious contradiction that persons of such perfection of power should themselves require the greatest care to guard them against threatening dangers. But this is not the only contradiction revealed in the treatment of royal persons on the part of savages. These races consider it necessary to watch over their kings, to see that they use their powers in the right way. They are by no means sure of their good intentions or of their conscientiousness. A strain of mistrust is mingled with the motivation of the taboo rules for the king. The idea that early kingdoms are despotisms, says Fraser, in which the people exist only for the sovereign, is wholly inapplicable to the monarchies we are considering. On the contrary, the sovereign in them exists only for his subjects. His life is only valuable so long as he discharges the duties of his position by ordering the course of nature for his people's benefit. So soon as he fails to do so, the care, the devotion, the religious homage which they had hitherto lavished on him cease and are changed into hatred and contempt. He is ignominiously dismissed and may be thankful if he escapes with his life. Worshipped as a god one day, he is killed as a criminal the next. But in this changed behavior of the people there is nothing capricious or inconsistent. On the contrary, their conduct is quite consistent. If their king is their god, he is, or should be, also their preserver. And if he will not preserve them, he must make room for another who will. So long, however, as he answers their expectations, there is no limit to the care which they take of him, and which they compel him to take of himself. A king of this sort lives hedged in by ceremonious etiquette, a network of prohibitions and observances of which the intention is not to contribute to his dignity, much less to his comfort, but to restrain him from conduct which, by disturbing the harmony of nature, might involve himself, his people, and the universe in one common catastrophe. Far from adding to his comfort, these observances, by trammeling his every act, annihilate his freedom and often render the very life which it is their object to preserve a burden and sorrow to him. One of the most glaring examples of thus fettering and paralyzing a holy ruler through taboo ceremonial seems to have been reached in the life routine of the Mikado of Japan, as it existed in earlier centuries. A description which is now over 200 years old relates, quote, from Kempfer, History of Japan. He thinks that it would be very prejudicial to his dignity and holiness to touch the ground with his feet. For this reason, when he intends to go anywhere, he must be carried thither on men's shoulders. Much less will they suffer that he should expose his sacred person to the open air, and the sun is not thought worthy to shine on his head. There is such a holiness ascribed to all the parts of his body that he dares to cut off neither his hair, nor his beard, nor his nails. However, lest he should grow too dirty, they may clean him in the night when he is asleep, because they say that what is taken from the body at that time hath been stolen from him, and that such a theft does not prejudice his holiness or dignity. In ancient times he was obliged to sit on the throne for some hours every morning with the imperial crown on his head, but to sit altogether like a statue without stirring either hands or feet, head or eyes, nor indeed any part of his body, because by this means it was thought that he could preserve peace and tranquillity in his empire. For if unfortunately he turned himself on one side or other, or if he looked a good while towards any part of his dominion, it was apprehended that war, famine, fire, or some other great misfortune was near at hand to desolate the country." End quote. Some of the taboos to which barbarian kings are subject vividly recall the restrictions placed on murderers. On Shark Point, at Cape Padron, in Lower Guinea, West Africa, a priest king called Kukulu lives alone in a woods. He is not allowed to touch a woman or to leave his house, and cannot even rise out of his chair, in which he must sleep in a sitting position. If he should lie down, the wind would cease, and the shipping would be disturbed. It is his function to keep storms in check, and in general to see to an even, healthy condition of the atmosphere. The more powerful a king of Loango is, says Bastian, the more taboos he must observe. The heir to the throne is also bound to them from childhood on. They accumulate about him while he is growing up, and by the time of his accession he is suffocated by them. Our interest in the matter does not require us to take up more space to describe more fully the taboos that cling to royal and priestly dignity. We merely add that restrictions as to freedom of movement and diet play the main role among them. But two examples of taboo ceremonial taken from civilized nations, and therefore from much higher stages of culture, will indicate to what an extent association with these privileged persons tends to preserve ancient customs. The Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter in Rome, had to observe an extraordinarily large number of taboo rules. He was not allowed to ride, to see a horse or an armed man, to wear a ring that was not broken, to have a knot in his garments, to touch wheat flour or leaven, or even to mention by name a goat, a dog, raw meat, beans, and ivy. His hair could only be cut by a free man and with a bronze knife. His hair combings and nail parings had to be buried under a lucky tree. He could not touch the dead, go into the open with a bare head, and similar prohibitions. His wife, the Flaminica, also had her own prohibitions. She was not allowed to ascend more than 3 steps on a certain kind of stairs, and on certain holidays she could not comb her hair. The leather for her shoes could not be taken from any animal that had died a natural death, but only from one that had been slaughtered or sacrificed. When she heard thunder, she was unclean until she had made an expiatory sacrifice. The old kings of Ireland were subject to a series of very curious restrictions, the observance of which was expected to bring every blessing to the country, while their violation entailed every form of evil. The complete description of these taboos is given in the Book of Rites, of which the oldest manuscript copies bear the dates 1390 and 1418. The prohibitions are very detailed and concern certain activities at specified places and times. In some cities, for instance, the king cannot stay on a certain day of the week, while at some specified hour this or that river may not be crossed. Or again, there is a plain on which he cannot camp a full 9 days, etc. Among many savage races, the severity of the taboo restrictions for the priest-kings has had results of historic importance, which are especially interesting from our point of view. The honor of being a priest-king ceased to be desirable. The person in line for the succession often used every means to escape it. Thus, in Cambodia, where there is a fire and water king, it is often necessary to use force to compel the successor to accept the honor. On Niue, or Savage Island, a coral island in the Pacific Ocean, monarchy actually came to an end because nobody was willing to undertake the responsible and dangerous office. In some parts of West Africa, a general council is held after the death of the king to determine upon the successor. The man on whom the choice falls is seized, tied, and kept in custody in the fetish house until he has declared himself willing to accept the crown. Sometimes the presumptive successor to the throne finds ways and means to avoid the intended honor. Thus it is related of a certain chief that he used to go armed day and night and resist by force every attempt to place him on the throne. Among the Negroes of Sierra Leone, the resistance against accepting the kingly honor was so great that most of the tribes were compelled to make strangers their kings. Fraser makes these conditions responsible for the fact that in the development of history a separation of the original priest kingship into a spiritual and a secular power finally took place. Kings, crushed by the burden of their holiness, became incapable of exercising their power over real things, and had to leave this to inferior but executive persons who were willing to renounce the honors of royal dignity. From these there grew up the secular rulers, while the spiritual overlordship, which was now of no practical importance, was left to the former taboo kings. It is well known to what extent this hypothesis finds confirmation in the history of old Japan. A survey of the picture of the relations of primitive peoples to their rulers gives rise to the expectation that our advance from description to psychoanalytic understanding will not be difficult. These relations are of an involved nature and are not free from contradictions. Rulers are granted great privileges which are practically cancelled by taboo prohibitions in regard to other privileges. They are privileged persons. They can do or enjoy what is withheld from the rest through taboo. But in contrast to this freedom, they are restricted by other taboos, which do not affect the ordinary individual. Here, therefore, is the first contrast, which amounts almost to a contradiction between an excess of freedom and an excess of restriction as applied to the same persons. They are credited with extraordinary magic powers, and contact with their person or their property is therefore feared, while on the other hand the most beneficial effect is expected from these contacts. This seems to be a second and an especially glaring contradiction. But we have already learned that it is only apparent. The king's touch, exercised by him with benevolent intention, heals and protects. It is only when a common man touches the king or his royal effects that the contact becomes dangerous, and this is probably because the act may recall aggressive tendencies. Another contradiction, which is not so easily solved, is expressed in the fact that great power over the processes of nature is ascribed to the ruler, and yet the obligation is felt to guard him with especial care against threatening dangers, as if his own power, which can do so much, were incapable of accomplishing this. A further difficulty in the relation arises because there is no confidence that the ruler will use his tremendous power to the advantage of his subjects, as well as for his own protection. He is therefore distrusted, and surveillance over him is considered to be justified. The taboo etiquette, to which the life of the king is subject, simultaneously serves all these objects of exercising a tutelage over the king, of guarding him against dangers, and of guarding his subjects against danger which he brings to them. We are inclined to give the following explanation of the complicated and contradictory relation of primitive peoples to their rulers. Through superstition as well as through other motives, various tendencies find expression in the treatment of kings, each of which is developed to the extreme without regard to the others. As a result of this, contradictions arise at which the intellect of savages takes no more offense than a highly civilized person would, as long as it is only a question of religious matters or of loyalty. That would be so far so good, but the psychoanalytic technique may enable us to penetrate more deeply into the matter and to add something about the nature of these various tendencies. If we subject the facts as stated to analysis just as if they formed the symptoms of a neurosis, our first attention would be directed to the excess of anxious worry, which is said to be the cause of the taboo ceremonial. The occurrence of such excessive tenderness is very common in the neurosis, and especially in the compulsion neurosis, upon which we are drawing primarily for our comparison. We now thoroughly understand the origin of this tenderness. It occurs wherever, besides the predominant tenderness, there exists a contrary but unconscious stream of hostility, that is to say, where the typical case of an ambivalent affective attitude is realized. The hostility is then cried down by an excessive increase of tenderness, which is expressed as anxiety and becomes compulsive because otherwise it would not suffice for its task of keeping the unconscious opposition in a state of repression. Every psychoanalyst knows how infallibly this anxious excess of tenderness can be resolved even under the most improbable circumstances, as for instance when it appears between mother and child, or in the case of affectionate married people. Applied to the treatment of privileged persons, this theory of an ambivalent feeling would reveal that their veneration, their very deification, is opposed in the unconscious by an intense hostile tendency, so that, as we had expected, the situation of an ambivalent feeling is here realized. The distrust, which certainly seems to contribute to the motivation of the royal taboo, would be another direct manifestation of the same unconscious hostility. Indeed, the ultimate issues of this conflict show such a diversity among different races that we would not be at a loss for examples in which the proof of such hostility would be much easier. We learn from Fraser that the savage Timis of Sierra Leone reserve the right to administer a beating to their elected king on the evening before his coronation, and that they make use of this constitutional right with such thoroughness that the unhappy ruler sometimes does not long survive his accession to the throne. For this reason the leaders of the race have made it a rule to elect some man against whom they have a particular grudge. Nevertheless, even in such glaring cases, the hostility is not acknowledged as such, but is expressed as if it were a ceremonial. Another trait in the attitude of primitive races toward their rulers recalls a mechanism which is universally present in mental disturbances and is openly revealed in the so-called delusions of persecution. Here the importance of a particular person is extraordinarily heightened, and his omnipotence is raised to the improbable in order to make it easier to attribute to him the responsibility for everything painful which happens to the patient. Savages really do not act differently towards their rulers when they ascribe to them power over rain and shine, wind and weather, and then dethrone or kill them because nature has disappointed their expectation of a good hunt or a ripe harvest. The prototype which the paranoiac reconstructs in his persecution mania is found in the relation of the child to its father. Such omnipotence is regularly attributed to the father in the imagination of the son, and distrust of the father has been shown to be intimately connected with the highest esteem for him. When a paranoiac names a person of his acquaintance as his persecutor, he thereby elevates him to the paternal succession and brings him under conditions which enable him to make him responsible for all the misfortune which he experiences. Thus this second analogy between the savage and the neurotic may allow us to surmise how much in the relation of the savage to his ruler arises from the infantile attitude of the child to its father. But the strongest support for our point of view, which seeks to compare taboo prohibitions with neurotic symptoms, is to be found in the taboo ceremonial itself, the significance of which for the status of kinship has already been subject of our previous discussion. This ceremonial unmistakably reveals its double meaning and its origin from ambivalent tendencies, if only we are willing to assume that the effects it produces are those which it intended from the very beginning. It not only distinguishes kings and elevates them above all ordinary mortals, but it also makes their life a torture and an unbearable burden, and forces them into a thraldom which is far worse than that of their subjects. It would thus be the correct counterpart to the compulsive action of the neurosis, in which the suppressed impulse and the impulse which suppresses it meet in mutual and simultaneous satisfaction. The compulsive action is nominally a protection against the forbidden action, but we would say that actually it is a repetition of what is forbidden. The word nominally is here applied to the conscious, whereas the word actually applies to the unconscious instance of the psychic life. Thus also the taboo ceremonial of kings is nominally an expression of the highest veneration and a means of guarding them. Actually, it is the punishment for their elevation, the revenge which their subjects take upon them. The experiences which Cervantes makes Sancho Panza undergo as governor on his island have evidently made him recognize this interpretation of courtly ceremonial as the only correct one. It is very possible that this point would be corroborated if we could induce kings and rulers of today to express themselves on this point. Why the emotional attitude toward rulers should contain such a strong unconscious share of hostility is a very interesting problem, which, however, exceeds the scope of this book. We have already referred to the infantile father complex. We may add that an investigation of the early history of kingship would bring the decisive explanations. Frazer has an impressive discussion of the theory that the first kings were strangers, who after a short reign were destined to be sacrificed at solemn festivals as representatives of the deity. But Frazer himself does not consider his facts altogether convincing. Christian myths are said to have been still influenced by the after effects of this evolution of kings. End of Chapter 2, Part 2. Read by Mary Schneider. Resemblances between the psychic lives of savages and neurotics by Professor Dr. Sigmund Freud, translated by A. Brill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Totem and Taboo, Chapter 2, Taboo and the Ambivalence of Emotions, Part 3. C. The Taboo of the Dead. We know that the dead are mighty rulers. We may be surprised to learn that they are regarded as enemies. Among most primitive people the taboo of the dead displays, if we may keep to our infection analogy, a peculiar virulence. It manifests itself in the first place in the consequences which result from contact with the dead and in the treatment of mourners for the dead. Among the Maori, anyone who had touched a corpse or who had taken part in its interment became extremely unclean and was almost cut off from intercourse with his fellow beings. He was, as we say, boycotted. He could not enter a house or approach persons or objects without infecting them with the same properties. He could not even touch his food with his own hands, which were now unclean and therefore quite useless to him. His food was put on the ground and he had no alternative except to seize it as best he could with his lips and teeth, while he held his hands behind his back. Occasionally he could be fed by another person who helped him to his food with outstretched arms so as not to touch the unfortunate one himself, but this assistant was then in turn subjected to almost equally oppressive restrictions. Almost every village contained some altogether disreputable individual, ostracized by society, whose wretched existence depended upon people's charity. This creature alone was allowed within arm's length of a person who had fulfilled the last duty towards the deceased. But as soon as the period of segregation was over and the person rendered unclean through the corpse could again mingle with his fellow beings, all the dishes which he had used during the dangerous period were broken and all his clothing was thrown away. The taboo customs after bodily contact with the dead are the same all over Polynesia, in Melanesia, and in part of Africa. Their most constant feature is the prohibition against handling one's food and the consequent necessity of being fed by somebody else. It is noteworthy that in Polynesia, or perhaps only in Hawaii, priest-kings were subject to the same restrictions during the exercise of holy functions. In the taboo of the dead on the island of Tonga, the abatement and gradual abolition of the prohibitions through the individual's own taboo power are clearly shown. A person who touched the corpse of a dead chieftain was unclean for 10 months, but if he was himself a chief, he was unclean for only 3, 4, or 5 months, according to the rank of the deceased. If it was the corpse of the idolized head chief, even the greatest chiefs became taboo for 10 months. These savages are so certain that anyone who violates these taboo rules must become seriously ill and die, that according to the opinion of an observer, they have never yet dared to convince themselves of the contrary. The taboo restrictions imposed upon persons whose contact with the dead is to be understood in the transferred sense, namely, the mourning relatives such as widows and widowers, are essentially the same as those mentioned above, but they are of greater interest for the point we are trying to make. In the rules hitherto mentioned we see only the typical expression of the virulence and power of diffusion of the taboo. In those about to be cited we catch a gleam of the motives, including both the ostensible ones and those which may be regarded as the underlying and genuine motives. Among the Shuswap in British Columbia, widows and widowers have to remain segregated during their period of mourning. They must not use their hands to touch the body or the head, and all utensils used by them must not be used by anyone else. No hunter will want to approach the hut in which such mourners live, for that would bring misfortune. If the shadow of one of the mourners should fall on him, he would become ill. The mourners sleep on thorn bushes, with which they also surround their beds. This last precaution is meant to keep off the spirit of the deceased. Plainer still is the reported custom of other North American tribes, where the widow, after the death of her husband, has to wear a kind of trousers of dried grass, in order to make herself inaccessible to the approach of the spirit. Thus it is quite obvious that touching, in the transferred sense, is after all understood only as bodily contact, since the spirit of the deceased does not leave his kin and does not desist from hovering about them during the period of mourning. Among the Agotenos, who live in Palawan, one of the Philippine Islands, a widow may not leave her hut for the first 7 or 8 days after her husband's death, except at night, when she need not expect encounters. Whoever sees her is in danger of immediate death, and therefore she herself warns others of her approach by hitting the trees with a wooden stick with every step she takes. These trees all wither. Another observation explains the nature of the danger inherent in a widow. In the district of Makio, British New Guinea, a widower forfeits all civil rights and lives like an outlaw. He may not tend a garden, or show himself in public, or enter the village, or go on the street. He slinks about like an animal in the high grass or in the bushes, and must hide in a thicket if he sees anybody, especially a woman, approaching. This last hint makes it easy for us to trace back the danger of the widower or widow to the danger of temptation. The husband who has lost his wife must evade the desire for a substitute. The widow has to contend with the same wish, and beside this she may arouse the desire of other men because she is without a master. Every such satisfaction through a substitute runs contrary to the intention of mourning and would cause the anger of the spirit to flare up. One of the most surprising, but at the same time one of the most instructive taboo customs of mourning among primitive races is the prohibition against pronouncing the name of the deceased. This is very widespread and has been subjected to many modifications with important consequences. Aside from the Australians and the Polynesians, who usually show us taboo customs in their best state of preservation, we also find this prohibition among races so far apart and unrelated to each other as the Samoyeds in Siberia and the Todas in South India, the Mongolians of Tartary and the Tuaregs of Sahara, the Aino of Japan and the Akamba and Nandi in Central Africa, the Tinguanes in the Philippines, and the inhabitants of the Nicobar Islands and of Madagascar and Borneo. Among some of these races the prohibition and its consequences hold good only for the period of mourning, while in others it remains permanent. But in all cases it seems to diminish with the lapse of time after the death. The avoidance of the name of the deceased is as a rule kept up with extraordinary severity. Thus among many South American tribes it is considered the gravest insult to the survivors to pronounce the name of the deceased in their presence, and the penalty set for it is no less than that for the slaying itself. At first it is not easy to guess why the mention of the name should be abominated, but the dangers associated with it have called into being a whole series of interesting and important expedients to avoid this. Thus the Masai in Africa have hit upon the evasion of changing the name of the deceased immediately upon his death. He may now be mentioned without dread by this new name, while all the prohibitions remain attached to the old name. It seems to be assumed that the ghost does not know his new name and will not find it out. The Australian tribes in Adelaide and in Counter Bay are so consistently cautious that when a death occurs almost every person who has the same name as the deceased, or a very similar one, exchanges it for another. Sometimes, by a further extension of the same idea, seen among several tribes in Victoria and in North America, all the relatives of the deceased change their names regardless of whether their names resemble the name of the deceased in sound. Among the Guaycuru in Paraguay, the chief used to give new names to all the members of the tribe on such sad occasions, which they then remembered as if they had always had them. Furthermore, if the deceased had the same name as an animal or object, etc., some of the races just enumerated thought it necessary to give these animals and objects new names, in order not to be reminded of the deceased when they mentioned them. Through this there must have resulted a never-ceasing change of vocabulary, which caused a good deal of difficulty for the missionaries, especially where the interdiction upon a name was permanent. In the 7 years which the missionary Dobrishover spent among the Abapans in Paraguay, the name for jaguar was changed 3 times, and the words for crocodile, thorns, and animal slaughter underwent a similar fate. But the dread of pronouncing a name which has belonged to a deceased person extends also to the mention of everything in which the deceased had any part. And a further important result of this process of suppression is that these races have no tradition or any historical reminiscences, so that we encounter the greatest difficulties in investigating their past history. Among a number of these primitive races, compensating customs have also been established in order to reawaken the names of the deceased after a long period of mourning. They are bestowed upon children, who are regarded as reincarnations of the dead. The strangeness of this taboo on names diminishes if we bear in mind that the savage looks upon his name as an essential part and an important possession of his personality, and that he ascribes the full significance of things to words. Our children do the same, as I have shown elsewhere, and therefore they are never satisfied with accepting a meaningless verbal similarity, but consistently conclude that when two things have identical names, a deeper correspondence between them must exist. Numerous peculiarities of normal behavior may lead civilized man to conclude that he too is not yet as far removed as he thinks from attributing the importance of things to mere names and feeling that his name has become peculiarly identified with his person. This is corroborated by psychoanalytic experiences, where there is much occasion to point out the importance of names in unconscious thought activity. As was to be expected, the compulsion neurotics behave just like savages in regard to names. They show the full complex sensitiveness toward the utterance and hearing of special words, as do also other neurotics, and derive a good many often serious inhibitions from their treatment of their own name. One of these taboo patients whom I knew had adopted the avoidance of writing down her name for fear that it might get into somebody's hands who thus would come into possession of a piece of her personality. In her frenzied faithfulness, which she needed to protect herself against the temptations of her fantasy, she had created for herself the commandment not to give away anything of her personality. To this belonged first of all her name, then by further application her handwriting, so that she finally gave up writing. Thus it no longer seems strange to us that savages should consider a dead person's name as a part of his personality, and that it should be subjected to the same taboo as the deceased. Calling a dead person by name can also be traced back to contact with him, so that we can turn our attention to the more inclusive problem of why this contact is visited with such a severe taboo. The nearest explanation would point to the natural horror which a corpse inspires, especially in view of the changes so soon noticeable after death. Mourning for a dead person must also be considered as a sufficient motive for everything which has reference to him. But horror of the corpse evidently does not cover all the details of taboo rules, and mourning can never explain to us why the mention of the dead is a severe insult to his survivors. On the contrary, mourning loves to preoccupy itself with the deceased, to elaborate his memory and preserve it for the longest possible time. Something besides mourning must be made responsible for the peculiarities of taboo customs, something which evidently serves a different purpose. It is this very taboo on names which reveals this still unknown motive, and if the customs did not tell us about it, we would find out from the statements of the mourning savages themselves. For they do not conceal the fact that they fear the presence and the return of the spirit of a dead person. They practice a host of ceremonies to keep him off and banish him. They look upon the mention of his name as a conjuration which must result in his immediate presence. They therefore consistently do everything to avoid conjuring and awakening a dead person. They disguise themselves in order that the spirit may not recognize them. They distort either his name or their own, and become infuriated when a ruthless stranger incites the spirit against his survivors by mentioning his name. We can hardly avoid the conclusion that they suffer, according to one's expression, from the fear of his soul now turned into a demon. With this understanding we approach one's conception who, as we have heard, sees the nature of taboo in the fear of demons. The assumption which this theory makes, namely, that immediately after death the beloved member of a family becomes a demon, from whom the survivors have nothing but hostility to expect, so that they must protect themselves by every means from his evil desires, is so peculiar that our first impulse is not to believe it. Yet almost all competent authors agree as to this interpretation of primitive races. Westermarck, who in my opinion gives altogether too little consideration to taboo, makes this statement, quote, "On the whole, facts lead me to conclude that the dead are more frequently regarded as enemies than as friends, and that Jevons and Grant Allen are wrong in their assertion that it was formerly believed that the malevolence of the dead was as a rule directed only against strangers, while they were paternally concerned about the life and welfare of their descendants and members of their clan." R. Kleinpaul has written an impressive book in which he makes use of the remnants of the old belief in souls among civilized races to show the relation between the living and the dead. According to him, too, this relation culminates in the conviction that the dead, thirsting for blood, draw the living after them. The living did not feel themselves safe from the persecutions of the dead until a body of water had been put between them. This is why it was preferred to bury the dead on islands or to bring them to the other side of a river. The expressions "here" and "beyond" originated in this way. Later moderation has restricted the malevolence of the dead to those categories where a peculiar right to feel rancor had to be admitted, such as the murdered who pursue their murderer as evil spirits, and those who, like brides, had died with their longings unsatisfied. Kleinpaul believes that originally, however, the dead were all vampires, who bore ill will to the living, and strove to harm them and deprive them of life. It was the corpse that first furnished the conception of an evil spirit. The hypothesis that those whom we love best turn into demons after death obviously allows us to put a further question. What prompted primitive races to ascribe such a change of sentiment to the beloved dead? Why did they make demons out of them? According to Westermarck, this question is easily answered. Quote, "As death is usually considered the worst calamity that can overtake man, it is believed that the deceased are very dissatisfied with their lot. Primitive races believe that death comes only through being slain, whether by violence or by magic, and this is considered already sufficient reason for the soul to be vindictive and irritable. The soul presumably envies the living and longs for the company of its former kin. We can therefore understand that the soul should seek to kill them with diseases in order to be reunited with them. A further explanation of the malevolence ascribed to souls lies in the instinctive fear of them, which is itself the result of the fear of death." Our study of psychoneurotic disturbances points to a more comprehensive explanation which includes that of Westermarck. When a wife loses her husband or a daughter her mother, it not infrequently happens that the survivor is afflicted with tormenting scruples called obsessive reproaches, which raise a question whether she herself has not been guilty through carelessness or neglect of the death of the beloved person. No recalling of the care with which she nursed the invalid or direct refutation of the asserted guilt can put an end to the torture, which is the pathological expression of mourning and which in time slowly subsides. Psychoanalytic investigation of such cases has made us acquainted with the secret mainsprings of this affliction. We have ascertained that these obsessive reproaches are in a certain sense justified and therefore are immune to refutation or objections. Not that the mourner has really been guilty of the death, or that she has really been careless, as the obsessive reproach asserts, but still there was something in her, a wish of which she herself was unaware, which was not displeased with the fact that death came, and which would have brought it about sooner had it been strong enough. The reproach now reacts against this unconscious wish after the death of the beloved person. Such hostility, hidden in the unconscious behind tender love, exists in almost all cases of intensive emotional allegiance to a particular person. Indeed, it represents the classic case, the prototype of the ambivalence of human emotions. There is always more or less of this ambivalence in everybody's disposition. Normally it is not strong enough to give rise to the obsessive reproaches we have described. But where there is abundant predisposition for it, it manifests itself in the relation to those we love most, precisely where you would least expect it. The disposition to compulsion neurosis, which we have so often taken for comparison with taboo problems, is distinguished by a particularly high degree of this original ambivalence of emotion. We now know how to explain the supposed demonism of recently departed souls, and the necessity of being protected against their hostility through taboo rules, by assuming a similar high degree of ambivalence in the emotional life of primitive races, such as psychoanalysis ascribes to persons suffering from compulsion neurosis. It becomes comprehensible that the same kind of reaction against the hostility latent in the unconscious behind the obsessive reproaches of the neurotic should also be necessary here after the painful loss has occurred. But this hostility, which is painfully felt in the unconscious in the form of satisfaction with the demise, experiences a different fate in the case of primitive man. The defense against it is accomplished by displacement upon the object of hostility, namely, the dead. We call this defense process, frequent both in normal and diseased psychic life, a projection. The survivor will deny that he has ever entertained hostile impulses toward the beloved dead, but now the soul of the deceased entertains them and will try to give vent to them during the entire period of mourning. In spite of the successful defense through projection, the punitive and remorseful character of this emotional reaction manifests itself in being afraid, in self-imposed renunciations, and in subjection to restrictions which are partly disguised as protective measures against the hostile demon. Thus we find again that taboo has grown out of the soil of an ambivalent emotional attitude. The taboo of the dead also originates from the opposition between the conscious grief and the unconscious satisfaction at death. If this is the origin of the resentment of spirits, it is self-evident that just the nearest and formerly most beloved survivors have to fear it most. As in neurotic symptoms, the taboo regulations also evince opposite feelings. Their restrictive character expresses mourning, while they also betray very clearly what they are trying to conceal, namely the hostility towards the dead, which is now motivated as self-defense. We have learnt to understand part of the taboo regulations as temptation fears. A dead person is defenseless, which must act as an incitement to satisfy hostile desires entertained against him. This temptation has to be opposed by the prohibition. But Westermarck is right in not admitting any difference in the savage's conception between those who have died by violence and those who have died a natural death. As will be shown later, in the unconscious mode of thinking, even a natural death is perceived as murder. The person was killed by evil wishes. Anyone interested in the origin and meaning of dreams dealing with the death of dear relatives, such as parents and brothers and sisters, will find that the same feeling of ambivalence is responsible for the fact that the dreamer, the child, and the savage all have the same attitude towards the dead. A little while ago we challenged Wundt's conception, who explains the nature of taboo through the fear of demons, and yet we have just agreed with the explanation which traces back the taboo of the dead to a fear of the soul of the dead after it has turned into a demon. This seems like a contradiction, but it will not be difficult for us to explain it. It is true that we have accepted the idea of demons, but we know that this assumption is not something final which psychology cannot resolve into further elements. We have, as it were, exposed the demons by recognizing them as mere projection of hostile feelings which the survivor entertains towards the dead. The double feeling, tenderness and hostility against the deceased, which we consider well-founded, endeavors to assert itself at the time of bereavement as mourning and satisfaction. A conflict must ensue between these contrary feelings, and as one of them, namely the hostility, is altogether or for the greater part unconscious, the conflict cannot result in a conscious difference in the form of hostility or tenderness, as for instance when we forgive an injury inflicted upon us by someone we love. The process usually adjusts itself through a special psychic mechanism, which is designated in psychoanalysis as projection. This unknown hostility, of which we are ignorant and of which we do not wish to know, is projected from our inner perception into the outer world and is thereby detached from our own person and attributed to the other. Not we, the survivors, rejoice because we are rid of the deceased. On the contrary, we mourn for him. But now, curiously enough, he has become an evil demon who would rejoice in our misfortune and who seeks our death. The survivors must now defend themselves against this evil enemy. They are freed from inner oppression, but they have only succeeded in exchanging it for an affliction from without. It is not to be denied that this process of projection, which turns the dead into malevolent enemies, finds some support in the real hostilities of the dead which the survivors remember and with which they really can reproach the dead. These hostilities are harshness, the desire to dominate, injustice, and whatever else forms the background of even the most tender relations between men. But the process cannot be so simple that this factor alone would explain the origin of demons by projection. The offenses of the dead certainly motivate in part the hostility of the survivors, but they would have been ineffective if they had not given rise to this hostility, and the occasion of death would surely be the least suitable occasion for awakening the memory of the reproaches which justly could have been brought against the deceased. We cannot dispense with the unconscious hostility as the constant and really impelling motive. This hostile tendency towards those nearest and dearest could remain latent during their lifetime, that is to say, it could avoid betraying itself to consciousness, either directly or indirectly, through any substitutive formation. However, when the person who was simultaneously loved and hated died, this was no longer possible, and the conflict became acute. The mourning originating from the enhanced tenderness became on the one hand more intolerant of the latent hostility, while on the other hand it could not tolerate that the latter should not give origin to a feeling of pure gratification. Thus there came about the repression of the unconscious hostility through projection, and the formation of the ceremonial in which fear of punishment by demons finds expression. With the termination of the period of mourning, the conflict also loses its acuteness, so that the taboo of the dead can be abated or sink into oblivion. 4. Having thus explained the basis on which the very instructive taboo of the dead has grown up, we must not miss the opportunity of adding a few observations which may become important for the understanding of taboo in general. The projection of unconscious hostility upon demons in the taboo of the dead is only a single example from a whole series of processes to which we must grant the greatest influence in the formation of primitive psychic life. In the foregoing case, the mechanism of projection is used to settle an emotional conflict. It serves the same purpose in a large number of psychic situations which lead to neuroses. But projection is not specially created for the purpose of defense. It also comes into being where there are no conflicts. The projection of inner perceptions to the outside is a primitive mechanism which, for instance, also influences our sense perceptions, so that it normally has the greatest share in shaping our outer world. Under conditions that have not yet been sufficiently determined, even inner perceptions of ideational and emotional processes are projected outwardly, like sense perceptions, and are used to shape the outer world, whereas they ought to remain in the inner world. This is perhaps genetically connected with the fact that the function of attention was originally directed not towards the inner world, but to the stimuli streaming in from the outer world, and only received reports of pleasure and pain from the endopsychic processes. Only with the development of the language of abstract thought through the association of sensory remnants of word representations with inner processes, did the latter gradually become capable of perception. Before this took place, primitive man had developed a picture of the outer world through the outward projection of inner perceptions, which we, with our reinforced conscious perception, must now translate back into psychology. The projection of their own evil impulses upon demons is only a part of what has become the world system Weltanschauung of primitive man, which we shall discuss later as Animism. We shall then have to ascertain the psychological nature of such a system formation, and the points of support which we shall find in the analysis of these system formations will again bring us face to face with the neurosis. For the present, we merely wish to suggest that the secondary elaboration of the dream content is the prototype of all these system formations. And let us not forget that beginning at the stage of system formation, there are two origins for every act, judged by consciousness, namely the systematic and the real but unconscious origin. Wundt remarks that, quote, among the influences which myth everywhere ascribes to demons, the evil ones preponderate, so that according to the religions of races, evil demons are evidently older than good demons, end quote. Now it is quite possible that the whole conception of demons was derived from the extremely important relation to the dead. In the further course of human development, the ambivalence inherent in this relation then manifested itself by allowing two altogether contrary psychic formations to issue from the same root, namely the fear of demons and of ghosts, and the reverence for ancestors. Nothing testifies so much to the influence of mourning on the origin of belief in demons as the fact that demons were always taken to be the spirits of persons not long dead. Mourning has a very distinct psychic task to perform, namely to detach the memories and expectations of the survivors from the dead. When this work is accomplished, the grief, and with it the remorse and reproach, lessens, and therefore also the fear of the demon. But the very spirits which at first were feared as demons now serve a friendlier purpose. They are revered as ancestors and appealed to for help in times of distress. If we survey the relation of survivors to the dead through the course of the ages, it is very evident that the ambivalent feeling has extraordinarily abated. We now find it easy to suppress whatever unconscious hostility towards the dead there may still exist, without any special psychic effort on our part. Where formerly satisfied hate and painful tenderness struggled with each other, we now find piety, which appears like a cicatrice and demands de mortuis nil nisi bene. Only neurotics still blur the mourning for the loss of the dear ones with the attacks of compulsive reproaches which psychoanalysis reveals as the old ambivalent emotional feeling. How this change was brought about, and to what extent constitutional changes and real improvement of familiar relations share in causing the abatement of the ambivalent feeling, need not be discussed here. But this example would lead us to assume that the psychic impulses of primitive man possessed a higher degree of ambivalence than is found at present among civilized human beings. With the decline of this ambivalence, the taboo, as the compromise symptom of the ambivalent conflict, also slowly disappeared. Neurotics who are compelled to reproduce this conflict, together with the taboo resulting from it, may be said to have brought with them an atavistic remnant in the form of an archaic constitution, the compensation of which, in the interest of cultural demands, entails the most prodigious psychic efforts on their part. At this point we may recall the confusing information which Wundt offered us about the double meaning of the word taboo, namely holy and unclean. It was supposed that originally the word taboo did not yet mean holy and unclean, but signified something demonic, something which may not be touched, thus emphasizing a characteristic common to both extremes of the later conception. This persistent common trait proves, however, that an original correspondence existed between what was holy and what was unclean, which only later became differentiated. In contrast to this, our discussions readily show that the double meaning in question belonged to the word taboo from the very beginning, and that it serves to designate a definite ambivalence as well as everything which has come into existence on the basis of this ambivalence. Taboo is itself an ambivalent word, and by way of supplement we may add that the established meaning of this word might of itself have allowed us to guess what we have found as the result of extensive investigation, namely that the taboo prohibition is to be explained as the result of an emotional ambivalence. A study of the oldest languages has taught us that at one time there were many such words which included their own contrasts, so that they were in a certain sense ambivalent, though perhaps not exactly in the same sense as the word taboo. Slight vocal modifications of this primitive word, containing two opposite meanings, later served to create a separate linguistic expression for the two opposites originally united in one word. The word taboo has had a different fate. With the diminished importance of the ambivalence which it connotes, it has itself disappeared, or rather the words analogous to it have vanished from the vocabulary. In a later connection I hope to be able to show that a tangible historic change is probably concealed behind the fate of this conception, that the word at first was associated with definite human relations which were characterized by great emotional ambivalence, from which it expanded to other analogous relations. Unless we are mistaken, the understanding of taboo also throws light upon the nature and origin of conscience. Without stretching ideas, we can speak of a taboo conscience and a taboo sense of guilt after the violation of a taboo. Taboo conscience is probably the oldest form in which we meet the phenomenon of conscience. For what is conscience? According to linguistic testimony, it belongs to what we know most surely. In some languages, its meaning is hardly to be distinguished from consciousness. Conscience is the inner perception of objections to definite wish impulses that exist in us. But the emphasis is put upon the fact that this rejection does not have to depend on anything else, that it is sure of itself. This becomes even plainer in the case of a guilty conscience, where we become aware of the inner condemnation of such acts which realized some of our definite wish impulses. Confirmation seems superfluous here. Whoever has a conscience must feel in himself the justification of the condemnation and the reproach for the accomplished action. But this same characteristic is evidenced by the attitude of savages towards taboo. Taboo is a command of conscience, the violation of which causes a terrible sense of guilt, which is as self-evident as its origin is unknown. It is therefore probable that conscience also originates on the basis of an ambivalent feeling from quite definite human relations which contain this ambivalence. It probably originates under conditions which are in force both for taboo and the compulsion neurosis. That is, one component of the two contrasting feelings is unconscious and is kept repressed by the compulsive domination of the other component. This is confirmed by many things which we have learned from our analysis of neuroses. In the first place, the character of compulsion neurotics shows a predominant trait of painful conscientiousness, which is a symptom of reaction against the temptation which lurks in the unconscious, and which develops into the highest degrees of guilty conscience as their illness grows worse. Indeed, one may venture the assertion that if the origin of guilty conscience could not be discovered through compulsion neurotic patients, there would be no prospect of ever discovering it. This task is successfully solved in the case of the individual neurotic, and we are confident of finding a similar solution in the case of races. In the second place, we cannot help noticing that the sense of guilt contains much of the nature of anxiety. Without hesitation it may be described as conscience phobia. But fear points to unconscious sources. The psychology of the neuroses taught us that when wish feelings undergo repression, their libido becomes transformed into anxiety. In addition, we must bear in mind that the sense of guilt also contains something unknown and unconscious, namely the motivation for the rejection. The character of anxiety in the sense of guilt corresponds to this unknown quantity. If taboo expresses itself mainly in prohibitions, it may well be considered self-evident, without remote proof from the analogy with neurosis that it is based on a positive, desireful impulse. For what nobody desires to do does not have to be forbidden, and certainly whatever is expressly forbidden must be an object of desire. If we applied this plausible theory to primitive races, we would have to conclude that among their strongest temptations were desires to kill their kings and priests, to commit incest, to abuse their dead, and the like. That is not very probable. And if we should apply the same theory to those cases in which we ourselves seem to hear the voice of conscience most clearly, we would arouse the greatest contradiction. For there we would assert with the utmost certainty that we did not feel the slightest temptation to violate any of these commandments, as for example the commandment "Thou shalt not kill," and that we felt nothing but repugnance at the very idea. But if we grant the testimony of our conscience the importance it claims, then the prohibition, the taboo as well as our moral prohibitions, becomes superfluous, while the existence of a conscience in turn remains unexplained, and the connection between conscience, taboo, and neurosis disappears. The net result of this would then be our present state of understanding, unless we view the problem psychoanalytically. But if we take into account the following results of psychoanalysis, our understanding of the problem is greatly advanced. The analysis of dreams of normal individuals has shown that our own temptation to kill others is stronger and more frequent than we had suspected, and that it produces psychic effects even where it does not reveal itself to our consciousness. And when we have learnt that the obsessive rules of certain neurotics are nothing but measures of self-reassurance and self-punishment erected against the reinforced impulse to commit murder, we can return with fresh appreciation to our previous hypothesis that every prohibition must conceal a desire. We can then assume that this desire to murder actually exists, and that the taboo as well as the moral prohibition are psychologically by no means superfluous, but are on the contrary explained and justified through our ambivalent attitude towards the impulse to slay. The nature of this ambivalent relation, so often emphasized as fundamental, namely that the positive underlying desire is unconscious, opens the possibility of showing further connections and explaining further problems. The psychic processes in the unconscious are not entirely identical with those known to us from our conscious psychic life, but have the benefit of certain notable liberties of which the latter are deprived. An unconscious impulse need not have originated where we find it expressed. It can spring from an entirely different place and may originally have referred to other persons and relations. But through the mechanism of displacement, it reaches the point where it comes to our notice. Thanks to the indestructibility of unconscious processes and their inaccessibility to correction, the impulse may be saved over from earlier times to which it was adapted to later periods and conditions in which its manifestations must necessarily seem foreign. These are all only hints, but a careful elaboration of them would show how important they may become for the understanding of the development of civilization. In closing these discussions, we do not want to neglect to make an observation that will be of use for later investigations. Even if we insist upon the essential similarity between taboo and moral prohibitions, we do not dispute that a psychological difference must exist between them. A change in the relations of the fundamental ambivalence can be the only reason why the prohibition no longer appears in the form of a taboo. In the analytical consideration of taboo phenomena, we have hitherto allowed ourselves to be guided by their demonstrable agreements with compulsion neurosis. But as taboo is not a neurosis but a social creation, we are also confronted with the task of showing wherein lies the essential difference between the neurosis and a product of culture like the taboo. Here again I will take a single fact as my starting point. Primitive races fear a punishment for the violation of a taboo, usually a serious disease or death. This punishment threatens only him who has been guilty of the violation. It is different with the compulsion neurosis. If the patient wants to do something that is forbidden to him, he does not fear punishment for himself, but for another person. This person is usually indefinite, but by means of analysis is easily recognized as someone very near and dear to the patient. The neurotic, therefore, acts as if he were altruistic, while primitive man seems egotistical. Only if retribution fails to overtake the taboo violator spontaneously does a collective feeling awaken among savages that they are all threatened through the sacrilege, and they hasten to inflict the omitted punishment themselves. It is easy for us to explain the mechanism of this solidarity. It is a question of fear of the contagious example, the temptation to imitate, that is to say, of the capacity of the taboo to infect. If someone has succeeded in satisfying the repressed desire, the same desire must manifest itself in all his companions. Hence, in order to keep down this temptation, this envied individual must be despoiled of the fruit of his daring. Not infrequently, the punishment gives the executors themselves an opportunity to commit the same sacrilegious act by justifying it as an expiation. This is really one of the fundamentals of the human code of punishment, which rightly presumes the same forbidden impulses in the criminal and in the members of society who avenge his offense. Psychoanalysis here confirms what the pious were wont to say, that we are all miserable sinners. How then shall we explain the unexpected nobility of the neurosis, which fears nothing for itself and everything for the beloved person? Psychoanalytic investigation shows that this nobility is not primary. Originally, that is to say at the beginning of the disease, the threat of punishment pertained to one's own person. In every case the fear was for one's own life, the fear of death being only later displaced upon another beloved person. The process is somewhat complicated, but we have a complete grasp of it. An evil impulse, a death wish, towards the beloved person is always at the basis of the formation of a prohibition. This is repressed through a prohibition, and the prohibition is connected with a certain act which by displacement usually substitutes the hostile for the beloved person, and the execution of this act is threatened with the penalty of death. But the process goes further, and the original wish for the death of the beloved other person is then replaced by fear for his death. The tender altruistic trait of the neurosis, therefore, merely compensates for the opposite attitude of brutal egotism, which is at the basis of it. If we designate as social those emotional impulses which are determined through regard for another person who is not taken as a sexual object, we can emphasize the withdrawal of these social factors as an essential feature of the neurosis, which is later disguised through overcompensation. Without lingering over the origin of these social impulses and their relation to other fundamental impulses of man, we will bring out the second main characteristic of the neurosis by means of another example. The form in which taboo manifests itself has the greatest similarity to the touching phobia of neurotics, the délire de toucher. As a matter of fact, this neurosis is regularly concerned with the prohibition of sexual touching, and psychoanalysis has quite generally shown that the motive power which is deflected and displaced in the neurosis is of sexual origin. In taboo, the forbidden contact has evidently not only sexual significance, but rather the more general one of attack, of acquisition, and of personal assertion. If it is prohibited to touch the chief, or something that was in contact with him, it means that an inhibition should be imposed upon the same impulse which on other occasions expresses itself in suspicious surveillance of the chief, and even in physical ill-treatment of him before his coronation. Thus the preponderance of sexual components of the impulse over the social components is the determining factor of the neurosis. But the social impulses themselves came into being through the union of egotistical and erotic components into special entities. From this single example of a comparison between taboo and compulsion neurosis, it is already possible to guess the relation between individual forms of the neurosis and the creations of culture, and in what respect the study of the psychology of the neurosis is important for understanding of the development of culture. In one way, the neuroses show a striking and far-reaching correspondence with the great social productions of art, religion, and philosophy, while again they seem like distortions of them. We may say that hysteria is a caricature of an artistic creation, a compulsion neurosis a caricature of a religion, and a paranoid delusion a caricature of a philosophic system. In the last analysis, this deviation goes back to the fact that the neuroses are asocial formations. They seek to accomplish by private means what arose in society through collective labor. In analyzing the impulse of the neuroses, one learns that motive powers of sexual origin exercise the determining influence in them, while the corresponding cultural creations rest upon social impulses and on such as have issued from the combination of egotistical and sexual components. It seems that the sexual need is not capable of uniting men in the same way as the demands of self-preservation. Sexual satisfaction is in the first place the private concern of the individual. Genetically, the asocial nature of the neurosis springs from its original tendency to flee from a dissatisfying reality to a more pleasurable world of fantasy. This real world which neurotics shun is dominated by the society of human beings and by the institutions created by them. The estrangement from reality is at the same time a withdrawal from human companionship. This is the end of Part 3 of Chapter 2 and the end of Chapter 2 as a whole. Read by Mary Schneider.